The Duke dropped the deed into a puddle of rancid oil and told Beatrice Holt she was welcome to everything inside the ruined press house: moldy linseed, torn burlap, a dead furnace, oil that smelled so strongly of rotten fish that dock workers covered their mouths at the door. He had already taken her father's textile works, blocked her access to good canvas and beeswax, and left her only 28 days before the army chose its winter supplier. To everyone watching, it was not an inheritance. It was a carefully arranged failure. But when Beatrice bent to retrieve the stained deed, she noticed something the Duke had walked past without seeing: a thin brown skin of old oil hardened against the stone press. She peeled it free. It bent between her fingers without cracking, and in that small, filthy scrap was a question powerful enough to threaten an entire monopoly. What if the worthless material the Duke had given her was only worthless because nobody before her knew how to make it change? Cold rain swept sideways across the Plymouth wharves when Sebastian Harcourt stopped beneath the broken eaves of the Rancid press. Behind him stood 2 warehouse clerks and a port factor who had come to witness the transfer. None of them entered farther than the doorway. The smell reached them first. Wet flaxseed had split inside swollen sacks along the walls. Old oil coated the stone floor in black patches and carried the sharp, fishy odour of something left too long in damp air. Water tapped through holes in the roof. At the centre of the shed, a hand-powered stone press stood motionless beneath years of hardened residue. The Duke touched one sagging sack with the end of his cane. It tore open. Grey-green seed spilled across the boards. "You have the press, the stock, and whatever you can make of it," he said. His voice remained almost courteous. That made the humiliation cleaner. Beatrice Holt looked at the deed in his gloved hand. Her father's weaving works had already passed into Harcourt control. The merchants who handled good sail canvas answered to his agents. So did the largest beeswax dealers between Plymouth and Exeter. That morning, one of them had informed Beatrice that no further purchases would be extended to her on credit. Harcourt knew exactly what he was giving her. "The army closes its winter material trial in 28 days, he continued. "I assume you were aware." "I was." He let the deed fall. One corner struck a puddle beside the press. The port factor looked away. Harcourt pressed his cane into another sack. "Do you intend to squeeze your family's honour out of this?" Beatrice bent and lifted the deed with 2 fingers. She did not answer him. Instead, she looked at the floor. The fresh oil around the paper was thin and dirty. Near the base of the press, however, older spills had changed. Layers of brown residue clung to the stone where years of air had reached them. One edge had curled away from the surface. Beatrice set the deed on a dry beam. Then she crossed the shed and crouched beside the press. Her thumbnail slipped beneath the curled edge. A narrow strip came free. It bent. It did not crumble. Harcourt watched her examine it. "There are no usable goods here," he said. Beatrice rubbed the hardened film between her fingers. It was tougher than dried grease should have been, and more flexible than wax in winter cold. Behind her, the Duke turned toward his carriage. His boots never touched the oily floor. When the door finally closed behind him, Beatrice remained beside the silent press, with the strip of brown film in her palm. She had no good canvas, no beeswax, almost no cash, and 28 days. But if ruined oil could harden into something that bent without breaking, the question was no longer whether the Rancid press contained value. It was whether she could learn to control that change before the Duke's deadline made the answer useless. By morning, Beatrice had divided the warehouse floor with chalk. The sacks nearest the leaking wall went into the first section. Their seams were black with mould, and when she opened one, the seed inside had clumped into warm, sour masses. Those she marked for disposal. A second group was damp, but still loose enough to test. The driest sacks, stacked high against the inner wall, she kept untouched. She worked without gloves until the cold made her fingers stiff. The press resisted first. Old oil had hardened around the stone collar, turning the mechanism sluggish. Beatrice used a narrow steel scraper to lift the worst of it away, then wiped the exposed surfaces with rough cloth until the handle moved with less drag. She was trying to force the lever down alone when a voice came from the doorway. "You'll split the pin before you turn that stone." The man standing there was broad through the shoulders, grey at the temples, and dressed in a patched dock coat. Thomas Pike had worked the press before Harcourt shut the place down. Beatrice knew the name from an old wage list, though she did not mention it. Then show me where the strain is wrong. He looked at her for a moment, perhaps expecting pride. Instead, she stepped aside. Pike reset the worn collar and shifted the timber brace by less than an inch. The handle dropped cleanly on the next pull. They pressed 3 small batches separately. Beatrice collected each stream of oil in a different glass cup. One ran dark and cloudy. Another was thinner. The driest seed produced a clearer amber liquid, though the rancid smell remained sharp enough to sting the nose. Pike watched her hold the cups against the window. You planning to sell that? Not yet. She spread a drop from each batch across 3 pieces of warm scrap iron. The thinnest films began to skin at the edges before the thicker drops changed at all. That mattered. So did the material left behind. Instead of throwing the pressed seed cakes into the waste pile, Beatrice stacked them near the dry wall. One had fallen beside the cold furnace. She broke off a corner, held it to a flame, and watched it smolder longer than expected before crushing it under her boot. Pike noticed. So now the rubbish burns. Everything burns badly if you use it badly. That earned the first hint of respect in his face. By dusk, Beatrice had a usable press. 3 oil grades, 1 pile of dry seed cake, and no product she could sell. The burlap remained the problem. Its weave was coarse enough to pass daylight. She chose the cheapest solution first. Tomorrow, she would brush the raw oil directly into the cloth and let the winter air do the rest. If it worked, she could earn money within days. If it failed, she would be spending the one resource the Duke had already limited for her: time. The next morning, Beatrice built 2 drying frames from warped timber Pike found behind the press house. The burlap sagged until she drove extra pegs into the corners and pulled the weave tight enough to stop it from shifting under the brush. She filtered the clearest oil through folded cloth, let the grit settle in a stone jar, then poured only the upper layer into a shallow pan. Her plan had 3 steps. Press the driest seed, filter the oil, coat enough cheap burlap to sell as farm covers before the army trial consumed what little time remained. It was not elegant, but elegance required money. Beatrice warmed the oil just enough to make it flow and brushed the first layer across the stretched cloth. The burlap darkened at once. Open spaces between the fibers filled with amber liquid, and for a few minutes the result looked better than it had any right to. Pike touched the back of the frame. It's coming through. It should. The next coat will close what remains. She believed that when she said it. The motion of the brush brought back a workbench from years earlier, her father setting strips of sailcloth beside a row of numbered jars, while Beatrice marked the hour each sample had been coated. He never judged a finish when it first shone. Wait, bend it, chill it, wet it. Only then did the surface tell the truth. Beatrice returned to the present and scratched 12-hour marks onto a board beside the frames. At sunset, the cloth still felt tacky. At 24 hours, pressing her thumb against one corner left a clear print. At 48, the surface had thickened, but it had not dried. The cold harbour air carried too much moisture, and the winter temperature was slowing the cure almost to nothing. Worse, the fishy smell had grown stronger as the oil sat exposed. Pike stood beside the second frame, with his hands in his coat pockets. How long before you can roll it? Beatrice tested another corner. A thread lifted with her finger. Not tomorrow. She had already spent money on brushes, timber, cloth, and the first repair to the press. Throwing the batch away now would preserve time. Waiting might preserve the material. She chose to wait one more day. That decision cost her before the next night was over. When Beatrice tried to lift the first sheet from its frame, the oily surface stretched in sticky strings between her fingers and the cloth. The winter air was not curing her coating. It was preserving her mistake. By the 4th morning, the first coated sheet had become useless. Beatrice tried to roll it once. The layers touched, gripped, and refused to separate. When Pike helped pull them apart, strands of half-cured oil stretched between the folds, taking fibers with them. The burlap tore in 3 places. A sour fish smell filled the shed. Then, Pike kicked open a wooden bin near the stove. Outside. Now, the wiping rags inside were warm. Beatrice carried them into the yard with iron tongs and spread them across wet stones, instead of leaving them compressed together. The heat trapped in oily cloth was weak, but unmistakable. 7 days remained behind them in ruined fabric, wasted labor, and oil she could not recover. Beatrice did not coat another yard. She cut the failed sheet into small squares. One she left untouched. One received less oil. Another went beside the stove. She warmed a fourth before spreading the thinnest film she could manage. The problem was no longer getting oil into the cloth. It was getting oxygen, heat, and time to work through the coating before winter defeated her. Her father had once used small quantities of metallic dryers in experimental finishes. Beatrice remembered the precautions before she remembered the formula. Keep the powder controlled. Keep air moving. Never treat more material than the vessel could safely hold. A metal works near Sutton Pool discarded litharge among its lead processing waste. Pike brought back only a small wrapped quantity. Beatrice opened every upper vent in the press house. She measured the litharge away from the furnace, dampened it before handling, and worked with the smallest test batch she could justify. The oil went into an iron pot. Heat changed it, slowly. The thin liquid moved more heavily against the stirring paddle as the temperature rose. The rancid odor remained, mixed now with hot metal and the dry smell of the furnace. Beatrice watched the surface, reduced the fire, and refused Pike's suggestion to hurry the batch. When the treated oil had cooled enough to spread safely, she stretched fresh burlap until every loose thread held tension. One thin coat, warm, curing. Then another. By the following day, the surface no longer took her fingerprint. A third coat closed the remaining spaces in the weave. Beatrice carried the finished sample outside, wrapped it around an iron bar left overnight in the cold, and bent it sharply. Pike expected the surface to fracture. It did not. The amber-brown coating flexed around the metal and returned smooth beneath her thumb. For the first time since Harcourt gave her the press, Beatrice was holding something that behaved like a product. Now, she had to discover whether it could survive somewhere harsher than her own hands. Beatrice made the next 3 sheets the same way. The oil came from the driest seed. Pike kept the press speed even. Beatrice weighed each treated batch before it reached the pan, marked the hour of every coat, and rejected one frame when a corner cured faster than the center. A single good sample could be luck. 3 had to behave alike. They did. That gave her cloth, but not proof. Martha Reed supplied the next step. She was a widowed sailmaker who worked from a narrow room above a cooper's shop and had refused Beatrice twice before agreeing to examine the material. "It will fight the needle," Martha said, pinching the coated burlap. "Then use fewer seams." Beatrice could not pay her full rate in advance. She offered half now, and the rest after the first sale. Martha accepted without enthusiasm. They cut a simple raincoat for Elias Ward, a lighthouse keeper who spent more nights facing channel weather than any laboratory sample ever would. Beatrice reinforced the shoulders, reduced unnecessary stitching, and coated narrow strips over the most exposed seams. Ward bought it cheaply because no established outfitter would guarantee it. That evening, the wind strengthened. By midnight, rain was moving almost horizontally across the harbour. Beatrice slept badly. Ward returned the following afternoon. The amber coat was dark with water. For 1 second, Beatrice thought the experiment had failed. Then Ward removed it. His wool jacket, underneath, was dry. He bent one sleeve backward, then forward. The coating showed no white fracture lines. At the elbow, where the burlap had stretched under repeated movement, the weave remained closed. "Cold didn't turn it to boards," he said. Beatrice checked the shoulder seams herself before answering. "And the wind? Better than my old wax coat." Ward placed the remaining payment on her work table. Then he added money for 2 more. 1 for Mercer, 1 for Hale. Same cut, if she can make them. Martha, standing beside the cutting table, looked at the coins and then at the soaked coat shedding water onto the floor. "When do you want the cloth cut?" It was the first question she had asked as part of the work, rather than as a favour. By evening, the story had travelled no farther than 3 lighthouse men, 2 dock workers, and a purchasing clerk, who happened to hear them arguing over who would receive the next coat first. That was far enough. The following morning, an envelope bearing the seal of the Army Procurement Office arrived at the Rancid press. Beatrice opened it beside the same stone press Harcourt had called worthless. They wanted to see her material. Across Plymouth, The Duke was receiving the same news. The army clerk expected Beatrice to bring a better canvas. Instead, she brought burlap. He turned the first sample toward the window and frowned at the coarse weave beneath the amber coating. "This is packing cloth." It was. That answer did not satisfy him, but it kept him looking. Back at the Rancid press, Beatrice built a test that removed appearance from the question. Pike fixed a timber beam across 2 posts and hung matched iron weights beneath 3 strips cut to the same width. Martha stitched each sample with the same thread and spacing. The first strip was untreated burlap. The second carried 1 cured coat. The third had received 3 thin coats, each dried before the next was applied. The untreated cloth failed first. Its weave opened around the stitching, then tore along the loosened fibers. The single-coated sample held longer. The third stretched, creaked, and remained intact. Beatrice lowered the weights before the timber rig became the weakest part of the experiment. She examined the cloth under daylight. The coating had not made weak fibers strong by magic. It had changed how they moved against one another. The cured film held the open weave together, spreading strain across more threads instead of allowing one gap to widen until it became a tear. That mattered because coarse burlap cost a fraction of the sale canvas Harcourt's suppliers controlled. Beatrice weighed the oil used on each yard and wrote the figures beside curing time, labour, and cloth cost. The numbers were not yet good enough for mass production, but they were already better than she had expected. A marine outfitter named Bell came after hearing about Ward's coat. He pulled the 3-coated sample between his hands. "I'll buy your process." Beatrice looked up. "For coats?" "For anything that keeps rain out. You can stop worrying about army inspectors." His offer would have paid her debts and repaired the roof. It would also have transferred control of the coating before she knew what it could become. No. Bell thought she had misunderstood the amount. She had not. That afternoon, Pike repeated the load test with a fresh batch. Then another. By the 3rd trial, Beatrice no longer had an unusual piece of cloth. She had a repeatable advantage. The next envelope from the procurement office gave her a place in the final winter trial. Before she finished reading it, wagon wheels stopped outside. 2 port officers entered carrying an inspection order. The Duke had stopped trying to prove her material worthless. Now he was going after the fire that made it possible. The inspection order was legitimate enough to be dangerous. The port officers did not accuse Beatrice of fraud. They measured the space around the furnace, checked how the oil was stored, counted the vents, and asked where her coal deliveries were recorded. Drying oil, heated in quantity, could burn. Everyone in the room knew it. That was why Harcourt had chosen safety instead of force. Beatrice answered every question. Then she changed the workshop before the officers could return. Pike marked a clear furnace boundary across the floor. Oil jars moved away from the heat. Martha organized the cutting tables so coated cloth never piled beside the stove. 2 women from the rope walk district, Ellen Shaw and Ruth Bell, were hired to stretch frames and record coating times. Beatrice numbered every batch. Seed source, oil weight, heating time, drying time, yardage. If the army asked whether one good sheet could be repeated, she intended to answer with more than confidence. For 6 days, the press ran from before sunrise until the evening tide turned. Pike worked the stone press in measured cycles. Martha cut the cured cloth. Ellen and Ruth coated in alternating passes, while Beatrice checked viscosity and surface tack before each frame moved into the warm room. The output began to look less like experiment and more like manufacture. Then the coal wagon stopped at the gate. The driver would not enter. "Port restriction," he said. "No fuel delivery without a revised fire certificate." Beatrice showed him the officer's temporary approval. He shook his head. "Mine says, I lose my harbour licence if I unload." The next supplier refused by noon. A wood merchant who had taken Beatrice's deposit sent the money back with no explanation at all. Harcourt had not closed the Rancid press. He had simply made heat difficult to purchase. By evening, the furnace was eating its final coal. Beatrice reduced the next oil batch rather than waste it at an unstable temperature. Pike objected until he saw the thermometer falling. They saved the treated oil. They lost the schedule. Outside the warm room, nearly 200 yards of burlap waited, with only 1 or 2 coats completed. The final army samples required full curing before they could be folded, stitched, and transported. The fire sank lower. A skin formed across the cooling oil in the iron pot. Martha stood beside the unfinished frames. How much time? Beatrice checked the trial notice again. 48 hours. She had workers now. She had a repeatable process. She had cloth. The army had agreed to test. And Harcourt had found the one part of that process she still depended on him to obtain from outside the walls. Heat. By midnight, the furnace was nearly cold. Pike had pulled the iron pot away before the remaining oil could scorch. Martha covered the unfinished cloth to keep dust from settling into the tacky surface. Ellen and Ruth stood beside the frames with nothing left to coat. "We withdraw," Pike said. "Better that than ruin everything." Beatrice looked across the press house. No coal. Wet timber outside. 48 hours reduced now to little more than a day and a half. Then she saw the seed cakes, stacked against the dry wall. They had been there since her first inspection. Pressed linseed residue, hard and brown, saved only because she had refused to throw away anything before understanding what it could do. Beatrice lifted one cake and broke it across her knee. The center was dry. "Bring me the brazier." Pike understood before the others did. "That won't run a curing fire." "We don't know that." She did not feed the furnace. Not yet. Instead, Beatrice weighed a small piece of seed cake, set it in the brazier with a measured amount of the last dry wood, and lit it beneath an iron plate. Pike adjusted the draft while she watched the thermometer. The cake burned slowly. Not cleanly, and not hot enough by itself, but it held heat longer than the wood. They repeated the test, with a different ratio. Then again. On the fourth attempt, the temperature remained inside the range. Beatrice needed long enough to heat a small batch without forcing the fire. Pike stared at the red core beneath the grate. "We could have sold those cakes." "I know." The pile represented feedstock value, lamp fuel experiments, perhaps money she would need after the trial. Beatrice carried another armful to the furnace. "If we miss tomorrow, they are worth nothing to us." That ended the argument. They abandoned any thought of finishing all 200 yards. Beatrice chose only what the army required. Pike rebuilt the fire in controlled layers of seed cake and dry scrap. Martha cut finished sections, while Ellen and Ruth moved frames through the curing room. Beatrice reduced every oil batch so a drop in temperature would destroy less material. The press house filled with heat again. Oil stirred thickly beneath the paddle. Thin amber films lost their tack one frame at a time. Outside, rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown conversation. By dawn, everyone's clothes smelled of hot linseed and smoke. One final panel remained. Beatrice pressed her thumb against the edge. No mark. Martha folded it carefully. The surface bent without sticking. They had not saved the production run. They had saved the proof. When the cart left for the army testing ground, the last usable seed cake was still glowing red beneath the furnace. Harcourt had closed every fuel merchant around her. He had never considered that the waste from her own press could keep the fire alive. The army testing ground stood on open ground above the harbour, where the wind came inland without shelter. Harcourt's pavilion was already erected when Beatrice arrived. His canvas looked superior at first glance. Tight weave, pale waxed surface, brass fittings, clean seams. Officers moved beneath it without ducking. Harcourt stood beside the entrance in the same dark waterproof coat he had worn at the Rancid press. Beatrice unloaded a smaller amber tent. One officer touched the coated burlap and frowned. "This is the material you propose for winter service?" "Yes, it looks like packing cloth." It began as packing cloth. She offered no defense beyond that. Instead, she placed 3 numbered samples on the inspection table, each taken from a different production batch. Beside them lay her curing times, oil weights, labor hours, and cost per yard. Then Elias Ward stepped forward, carrying the first slicker. "The coat has already seen channel weather," Beatrice said. "Test it as well." The officers began with cold. Both materials were left exposed until the waxed canvas stiffened beneath the wind. Each sample was folded repeatedly around the same metal bar. Fine, pale lines appeared first across Harcourt's coating. Beatrice's cloth bent with more resistance than ordinary fabric, but its surface remained continuous. Then came water. A hand pump drove a hard stream against both tents, while assistants changed the angle and struck the seams, roof folds, and tension points. Inside Harcourt's pavilion, the first leak appeared where a cold, stressed fold crossed a stitched panel. Another followed. The wax had not dissolved. It had fractured. Water found the fractures. Inside Beatrice's tent, the sound was violent enough to make speech difficult, but the floor beneath the tested wall remained dry. The final trial used load. Equal weights were attached near matched seams. Harcourt's canvas held well until the weakened coating cracked farther and the wet fibers began to distort around the stitching. Beatrice's burlap stretched. The coating held the open weave together. It did not make the cloth invincible. It kept a small weakness from becoming a larger one. The senior inspector asked for the 3 numbered Holt samples. All from separate batches? Yes. Same method? Beatrice handed him the batch sheets. Same limits. Same coating sequence. Same curing test before release. He studied the figures longer than he had studied her face. That was the moment Harcourt lost control of the room, not when his tent leaked. When the officers understood that Beatrice had brought a process, not a trick. By late afternoon, the procurement board suspended Harcourt's exclusive winter canvas contract pending review. Holt received an emergency order and provisional approval as an army supplier, subject to continued batch testing. Harcourt said nothing until the papers were signed. Then he looked across the wet field at Beatrice's ugly amber tent, still standing under the pump. 28 days earlier, he had decided what her ruined press was worth. Now other men were calculating what his monopoly had cost them. And once they began that calculation, how much else would they decide to examine? The first army order did not make Beatrice wealthy. It made the roof worth repairing. Within a week, new slate covered the worst leaks at the Rancid press. Coal arrived under a supplier contract. The Port Authority could no longer quietly interrupt. Pike took charge of the pressing floor. Martha moved her cutting tables into a dry room of her own. Ellen and Ruth trained 4 more women to stretch cloth, record coating times, and reject any sheet that failed the bend test. Nothing left the building without a batch number. The seed cakes were no longer burned simply because they could be. Beatrice kept most for sale and stored a dry reserve beside the furnace in case another shipment failed. Waste had become useful, but usefulness required discipline. The Hogamy order became a second order. Then a naval outfitter requested samples. Across Plymouth, Harcourt's position contracted more slowly than Beatrice's business expanded. The review of his winter canvas exposed earlier complaints that had once been dismissed as bad weather or careless handling. His exclusive purchasing privileges were withdrawn. Several merchants who had obeyed him without question began accepting other contracts. He kept his title. He did not keep the market. Months later, one of the textile buildings taken from the Holt family was offered for sale after Harcourt's partners began disposing of unprofitable holdings. Beatrice did not ask for it back. She bought it. The deposit came from Holt oilcloth earnings. The balance came through credit secured against signed orders and production records. On the morning the old weaving floor reopened, she did not hang her father's portrait over the entrance. She placed a new inspection board beside the coating room. At the top were 2 words: Holt Process. Below them were the same things she had once scratched onto scrap wood: oil weight, heating time, coating sequence, cure time, bend result. A name restored as a method was worth more to her than a speech. By winter's end, the Rancid press no longer smelled of stagnant oil and wet seed. Warm linseed, timber and furnace smoke filled the building. Amber rolls stood where moldy sacks had once sagged against the walls. Beatrice pressed the army acceptance stamp onto the next shipment. Under the stamp block lay the original deed. One corner still carried the black oil stain from the day Harcourt had dropped it at her feet. Rain struck the roof hard enough to be heard over the turning press. Outside, a Holt wagon rolled toward the harbour, its cargo covered in amber oilcloth. The cloth bent under the wind. The goods beneath it stayed dry. Beatrice watched until the wagon cleared the yard, then turned back toward the furnace. 28 days had been enough to prove the material. What came after had proved something harder. The Rancid press had never needed rescue. It had needed someone who understood what its waste could become.